group of 8 former ASC presidents who are here to share some stories with you. And the basis for this session, it's kind of like sort of Thanksgiving dinner, right? Where there's some grandparents there, they're going to tell you stories about what makes your family your family. And the idea behind this is that as ASC, we have a lot of stories to share, and leaning on Clifford Geertz's idea of what makes a culture, which he felt was the stories that we tell ourselves about ourselves. And this storytelling is a rich part of the history of ASC. Some of the stories are ones that we all know. Some of them are ones that, as we're speaking as a group of former presidents, we would probably be surprising ourselves about that. But one of the things for me that's been amazing about my experience with ASC, well, in addition to how we happen to be having a 60th anniversary when there have been starts and stops, and how this is actually something borrowed from Mary Catherine Bateson, it's the idea we have different ways of storing ourselves, that we can do this as some continuity. We did this, we did this, we did this. It's kind of linear, right? And it might be that with ASC, where we value nonlinearity, in fact, we even talk about the nonlinearity of linear systems, that our story is really one of a lot of starts and stops and discontinuities. So how is it that we've had some 60 years of discontinuities that make a continuous stream of these various streams coming together? So what I would like us to do is that we will go in order that we were president. So very quick introduction. Everyone will introduce themselves, and then I'll have the dilemma of how to be kind of the moderator asking someone to move on to the next person, which I'm not very good at. So we'll begin with Stuart Umpleby. This is in the order that people were president. Then Bill Reckmeyer. Then Larry Richards. Then Fred Steyer. Then Hilly Bonnell, who's joining us from Vancouver. And then Elena Leonard. Oh no, Luke, where is Luke?
He was here this morning.
Okay. He's in a knot somewhere, I suppose. When Lou gets here, I'll insert, and he has time to get here. And then Paul Pandera, who has the unique standing of being both a former and current president. Whatever that might mean.
That's fun.
So, Stuart, how are you?
Give him the microphone.
Take the mic. Yeah, I don't have the microphone.
Paul knows how to work these things.
See me as well as hear me.
Oh, one other quick thing while Stuart's getting the microphone is that one of the other things sort of inside and outside, and many of you have been part of our group for quite a long time. What is cybernetics to insiders and outsiders together? And so one of the stories we might lean on Bill to tell a little bit more about is when he was traveling to an ASC meeting in Norway, I think it was, that the border patrol person asked him where he was going. He just said a cybernetics meeting, and the guy said, "That's about freezing dead people, isn't it?"
I don't think that story is true.
Well,
We should tell that story, and I'm now definitely going to tell the real story.
actually, it's Paul's story about Paul's story.
Never.
Okay, well, somebody once said that.
Might want to turn that on.
It is on.
It
is on. Put up green light.
Oh, the green light is on, yes.
So, speak into
Well,
it.
you might want to.
Someone said that they liked what I said when I spoke earlier, I guess, at the ISSS meeting about the different stages of cybernetics as I perceived it, and I meant just find 4, actually, where the first would be engineering cybernetics, machine-oriented, like computers and automatic control and things like that. Then there was a period of biological cybernetics where you had biologists like Matrana and Varela and Gregory Bateson and so forth. And then there was a period of social cybernetics with Bateson and Mead and Beer and other people who were primarily interested in social systems. And now we have a new field that sort of sprung up and came as a surprise to me, at least, and that's design cybernetics with Ronald Glanville and a lot of people who are here or are nearby, Tom Fisher and so forth. So I think that's adequate evidence that it's a very interdisciplinary field. It's an evolving field. It touches on many other disciplines, and it's alive and well. So, glad to be here.
Thank you, Stu. And in terms of our own unfolding process, we'll talk and then share some stories with each other, but also in the true spirit of the participatory nature of ASC, opening up questions, comments, stories that we didn't tell that we should have told, stories that we didn't tell that we probably shouldn't have told.
You want me to stand or sit? Can you see me okay?
Ask the guy.
Or is it too much of a glare? Actually, I had several stories. I wasn't quite sure whether we wanted stories that reference the history, historical stuff that was interesting, or had cybernetic insights. And I thought the best thing would be to have stories about some of the history that had cybernetic insights. And the story I was actually going to tell, which I am now definitely going to tell, this is the story that led to that observation. So early in my career, I got involved in system science and then cybernetics, initially through Stuart Umpleby's work. I was doing graduate work in history here in DC, and was asked by the SGSR at the time to organize its 25th anniversary conference, which was really unheard of because it was the first time a non-president had been asked to organize a conference, and it was a big round number. So that I knew enough to know that that was important. I think it was because I know it was because I was with the Cybernetic Systems program at San Jose State, which is the first in the world that did cybernetics and systems. And for whatever reason, they asked me to. And I said I had one condition. Smart ass, I had a condition. They were asking me to do something really, really impressive and opportunistic and unprecedented for the organization. I said, I just think there are multiple streams within the field, and I would like to have the opportunity to invite other people to participate in this conference that are not just in the SGSR. And I'm not telling you this as just general background context. It has a direct bearing on what the story is. So I set up 3 streams, and one was for systems, and one was for cybernetics, and one was for system dynamics. Because at the time, those are 3 major vectors. I did that again when the ASC asked me to do the 20th anniversary, and we were in California. And we had Stafford Beer as a speaker, we had Danelle Meadows as a speaker, and we had Kenneth Boulding as a speaker. Boulding and Von Forrester were my dissertation advisors that saved my ass because my committee had no idea what I was doing. But the reason is, so we ended up having this conference in Toronto, 1981, okay? And it was really eclectic. There were 200 plus people there, but what led then to part of the story was that David Mitchell, who some of you may remember, who was at Concordia in Montreal, said, well, since you're all nearby and you've invited all these people, do you think we could organize something here at Concordia? And I said, sure, you feel like doing it? And then Barry Clemson was saying, since we have all these people gathered together and they're at cyber, do you think we could organize something in Orono, because that's where he was in Maine? So it ended up being that we were there in January. I just remember it's 40 degrees below zero. Cars would go down the streets outside of Montreal, and you weren't sure whether they could stop, but they certainly crinkled. And so anyway, we had the conference in Toronto, then we all took a train, those of us who were going to Montreal. And on the inside of that train, it was so cold outside that the condensation got 2 inches thick.
Wow.
In places. But it was Stafford Beer, it was Gordon Pask, I believe Paul Pangaro was there. There were several other people that were on that. I have pictures, most of them, many of them with people having cigarettes in their ears. Pask started that. I did not start that. I just have the documentary evidence. Anyway, so we had this conference, and then we all got on the plane, not all of us, but a
Recording
number
in
of us,
progress.
and went and took a flight to Maine, and then had a follow-up conference focusing on the work of Stafford Beer. So there was a continuity to this that was interesting. So the impromptu in Montreal, we had a banquet, and David said, since we're all here, why don't we, just say a little bit, because we never get Stafford Beer and Gordon Pask and other people there. So they started telling stories. And Stafford told a story about Norbert Wiener, and the story was, and I'm going to condense it because the story, but basically he said, he came home from work one day, he was noted, absent-minded, etc. He went to his house, knocked on the door, it was locked, he couldn't get in, he couldn't figure out what was happening. He started out in the street, and I'm condensing it, I don't do justice. Stafford really told this story really well. And he's stroking his beard, and he's doing, glaring and looking around the room and pausing for effect. And he runs into the street and he says, I can't get into my house. And he sees this little girl there and everything else. He said, young lady, do you know what happened to the house? I can't get in. He said, Daddy, we moved. So we got up afterwards, and a number of us telling stories, and because I had been this organizer of the conference in Toronto, I told a story that I had started, people were asking me, what's cybernetics? And I had a smart-ass answer at the time, and I just said, well, that's about freezing dead people. And my experience then, and my experience recently, was that roughly half the people say, really? Another half of people say, no, that's not really what it is. But then you could have a conversation. Stafford got up and said, I don't believe it. He says, there's no way that could happen. It's okay, fine. We were all then going through customs to leave the country, and this is where the story was. We're going through the exit interviews, not interviews, but going through line, getting on the plane, leaving the airport to go out on the plane to go to Maine. And I'm in the front, Stafford's right behind me, and behind that's Gordon Pask, I can't remember who it was, but there's a long line of cyberneticians going through customs, exit customs. And I'm there, and the gentleman, who at the time looked really old to me, but I think he was probably in his 40s, said, so what were you here for? Did you have a good time? I said, yeah, we were here. He said, what were you here for? I was here for a conference. Oh, and he's going through the passport. He said, and what was the conference about? I said, well, it's about something you probably had never heard of, but it's about cybernetics. And he said, oh, I know what that is. I said, what is it? He said, it's about freezing dead people. Stafford looked at me, because he's listening right here, half a foot away, says, no. So I tell that story because there's some humor in it, and some of you know Stafford and his legendary status. The point is, it's still an issue in the field. 40 years later, Ben Sweeting raised some of these points in his initials. What do you call it? What do you say? I'm interested in engaging other people because I think cybernetics, like Bateson does, not because of Bateson, but like Bateson, I think it's the biggest bite of fruit in the whole knowledge apple. That and systems for a variety of reasons. So I welcome the opportunity to have conversations. I don't think, my observation is this, is that back then, humorous, now it's still happening, except now it's about computers.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay? I just think we should, and I regret the fact that we're not very good as a group. Individuals have different kinds of traction, but as a group, I don't think we've been very effective at all in 40 years in being able to communicate with people about why this field is so relevant, especially given the issues facing the Anthropocene. And I think there's some insight from that little exchange that there's still an awful lot of people that think it's dead people, computers, or something else. And when you try to tell them why it's helpful or share with them why it might be useful, it's still really difficult. And I know it's tough with the transdisciplinary field. But anyway, that's my story.
Thanks. Yeah, thank you, Bill. And so maybe we need to restory ourselves as we tell our stories. Larry.
Just a comment about Stuart Appleby also. My first conference at which I presented a paper on cybernetics, my first conference actually ever. It was Stuart that invited me to come there to be on the program, and you'll see Stuart's thread through much of what we talk about here. I'd like to use my time to talk about Bill Reckmeyer. When Bill was president, he would often be asked and would often offer what he thought the American Society for Cybernetics was all about. And the response that I remember was, it's a context for hugs. And that was taken up by a number of people, but in particular I want to mention Rodney Donaldson. Rodney Donaldson was a president of the American Society for Cybernetics, and he liked that. He liked that very much. In that spirit, it turns out, I think, that today is Bill Reckmeyer's birthday.
You SOB.
How did you know that?
And I think,
Facebook.
I think it would be appropriate for us to sing happy birthday to him, but with one little variation. Feel free
To hug him.
to, as you sing, for those that are willing to participate, to go off key.
No problem.
Okay? Everyone understand?
No.
See?
Off key.
Yeah, I heard you, but why?
Why?
We'll find, we'll see. Okay. Ready?
No.
Once more.
Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday. Happy birthday.
Thank you very much.
You wouldn't dare ask.
Birthday boy. It's not my birthday. So, I was president after Larry, and we were in the same place when I was president.
What year?
Gosh,
What years?
89 to 91. Larry had started the Center for Cybernetic Studies in Complex Systems, where Larry was there, I was there. Barry Clemson, also a former president, was there. And Gordon Pask, who was behind all of the stories that we're telling, was also there. My first year organizing meeting, however, was in 1984, which I thought was the 20th anniversary meeting, although Bill took credit for the 20th anniversary meeting in 81. But it shows that we don't operate in terms of normal mathematics at ASC. I don't throw things out. So I went back and looked at some, I actually have this file of people that were interested in coming to the meeting, which was in Philadelphia, writing to see if they would have a paper or a presentation or a panel accepted. And it was incredible. Well, first of all, it's incredible I still have this.
Yes.
But also, although it's not that incredible if you know me because I don't throw things out, but how people framed their letters with the paper saying, you know, I'm not so sure that I really fit in. However, here is a paper, and most of the papers were excellent, and they really did fit in. And I mention that because I think we have this history of having a core group who are really committed to the ideas, who have a shared language. But we also have a number of people, and we're seeing this at the meeting today, that are boundary spanners in the sense of coming from other areas and who do work that really fits with cybernetics and are happy to join us. So the notion, and this is one of the things that always struck me, is that the notion of how do we actually apply the very cybernetic principles that we value so much to our own way of organizing really is quite a real statement. And the other part of the story that I wanted to tell is that this has shown up in many different meetings that we've had where we've had people who do very rich cybernetic work who you wouldn't think of as core cyberneticians. So I'm remembering a meeting that we had in 1991 in Amherst, Massachusetts. And we were privileged to have as one of the presenters Arthur Penn. I don't know if people
I remember
know him.
that one.
Arthur Penn was a film directed
director.
Bonnie and Clyde. And his wife, Peggy Penn, was an actor and family therapist. And he said he wasn't sure how his work would fit in. And he gave this absolutely wonderful talk about how directing relied very heavily on cybernetic ideas, including notions of recognizing continuity, but also recognizing some elements of deception. So, for example, he told the story of how people like Gene Hackman liked to be told what to do, and yet Arthur Penn was trying to get them to improvise, so he would set up this thing with the camera person saying, when I say cut, don't cut. And to pick up what was going on in the ensuing moments that was still being recorded but wasn't officially part of the recording. We also had at that same meeting a musician, who know him back there, who knows Gene very well, Jean Bamberger, who again said, cybernetics, I don't really know much about that, but her work in music and her work in learning to design and design for learning, which she taught a course with Don Schoen around that, absolutely fits in terms of notions of how do we bring cybernetic ideas to learning, how do we bring cybernetic ideas to our own learning about learning with others who we see as not doing things that fit within the norms. Jean just recently turned 100 years old and is still very active, bringing ideas of creativity and learning that rely very heavily on music and cybernetic ideas. So,
and she just finished another book last year.
Wow.
Right.
right. So some of the stories, and I guess what those, for me, embodies the importance of recognizing boundary crossing, boundary spanners, and people that connect with our work that help enrich our group. So, Pilet. Hi, Pilet. Here's the microphone.
Hello. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, good. You were asking for stories, and I'm not much of a storyteller. As those of you who've seen my work, I rely on visuals as a crutch to kind of tell me what I should be talking about. But there's a few thoughts I've had that are kind of based on my own story of how I got involved with you all. I think this organization has been not only transdisciplinary, as several of the presidents have spoken of, but it's been transgenerational and inclusive, long before those words became common usage. There I was in '95, my friend Kathleen Forsyth, who had been coming to these conferences, said, come, but I knew nothing about cybernetics. I arrived as a naive person, became enthused, found myself, as somebody said, hugged by various people here in the sense of being embraced into the community. And only 4 years later, here I was suddenly by some fluke the president of the society. How did that happen? And what I didn't know then was that it took a meeting of the elders getting together what to do with this young upstart who's suddenly in this role. And apparently they decided to trust me. And what my theme is that nothing more than trust induces responsibility. Trusting those that are coming to volunteer and do makes us feel responsible. What you don't know it was, I also had to have a very long conversation with Frank Galushka, who was president before me, before I even considered this as what's entailed. And well, with that trust came a certain amount of freedom. So I had great fun setting up the first conference in 2001. Never done anything like that before. I had to volunteer to teach a course at UBC to get at the space. So I talked about the people who were coming to the conference. And that created a very good connection for the various students on campus who then wanted to be part of it. And we did the usual things like a pre-conference workshop, and but we also did a forum, a public forum. There was such enthusiasm around the group around me that the energy was adequate to do a bunch of things. So we invited various speakers, again from the outside, ways that had to do with cybernetics. Brian Swim, Jan Neisler, Candace Pert. They didn't know they were cyberneticians, but the people did appreciate them. We were perhaps a little bit over-ambitious kids. We didn't quite make it financially even at that conference because these speakers needed honoraria. And that's also where we invented play shops. Largely inspired by Kathleen's enthusiasm in her before, but also I had become quite enticed by Maturanda's ideas of play is the only activity that feeds intelligence. Love is the only emotion and that enhances intelligence. And that brings the last point that I think is really relevant. I hate not being there because a lot of you have become my friends. And where else in a society like this could one expect to become friends with the prominent people in the field? So that some of the people we've lost that I feel are lost friends are Roberto, Heinz, Randall, Klaus. These are all people I had lots of conversations with outside the ASC in the meetings. And I recognize that this mean, the spirit, the mood, the group mood of inclusiveness and trust is ongoing. And now it has more of a framework in the colloquy. There we have this intergenerational trust that I think seems to be part of the lifeblood of this organization. So ideally, I'd like to give you a hug. Thank you.
Elena, and just as a transition, so because Pele did mention Frank Galushka, Frank was a president between
Is he here?
Rodney,
Early
who's no
90s.
longer here, and Pele. Couldn't be here, but I still keep up with him, and he said, well, I have one word that I would like to say, which is magic.
Yeah.
And that was Frank's stuff.
Well, thank you, and I'd like to give a shout out to Pele because that conference in BC was a wonderful conference, and it introduced us also to Candace Pert, who Stafford was instrumental in giving award for the World Organization of Systems and Cybernetics at the one that we held in Toronto in 2000. At any rate, I was president from 2002 through 4. I had really a very easy time of that because the first conference was in Santa Cruz, and that was mostly done. And the second one of my presidency was one that had been organized in Vienna. And so I really only had to roll up my sleeves and organize the one in Toronto in 2004, whereupon I was able to hand over to Lou. But one of the things I would like to mention is that Stafford, who was my partner, loved to tell stories. And one of the stories he told about Heinz von Forster and Margaret Mead, I'd like to repeat here because I think it's worth repeating.
All right.
Is Heinz and Margaret were going to the Hermitage in Russia, and Margaret Mead had a cane, and you're not allowed to bring a cane into the Hermitage. So Heinz said, give me the cane. So she did. He put it down his pant leg and walked her in. You know the story.
I know Heinz.
At any rate, so they walk into the Hermitage. They're in there. Heinz pulls the cane out, hands it to Margaret, and says, "Okay, let's go see some art." And she said, "Well, how did this work? Because we're not allowed to have this in here." And he said, if you're in here, it means it's okay. You've passed the boundary. At any rate, Stafford was full of stories about Heinz, Warren McCullough, Norbert Wiener, all these people that he knew. And interestingly, he was part of the second generation of cyberneticians. And people tend to think, oh, it's a long time ago. He must have been among the first. Well, no. Wiener, McCullough, all of those people, von Neumann, the people at the Macy conferences. And Heinz in those days was quite a young man. So he was in there with a lot of people who were his elders. And they got him to do the translation or the transcription so that would be a spur for him to improve his English, which by the time I met him had improved a great deal. At any rate, it was a real honor to have served in this office, and what Pile said about the hubs is right. It's a very small community, and so I think a lot of us not only like each other, but think that we ought to be supportive of each other and encourage each other. And so now I'll hand it over to Lou.
Thank you. I'm going to reminisce a bit about some of the beginning places where I came in relation to cybernetics. Not so much about when I was president. Early in the 1980s, somewhere in there, I met Annetta, and it was in one of those conferences where she was making books out of people's conversations. I got the idea that I would like to write a book. And so we talked about the possibility of writing a book and got together in Urbana probably around 1987 with a number of people from the Urbana group. And I talked to them, we talked together about coloring maps, and the book on coloring maps evolved out of that conversation. And there were certain things that happened there that are worth remembering. For example, we talked to Herbert Brun about it. We told him about what we were doing, and I told him what I was doing and how this could maybe help us understand how to prove the four-color theorem. And I started explaining what that involved, being a mathematician. And he stopped me and he said, well, why don't you just state that four colors suffice to color a map? In a way, every proof that anybody ever made comes down to that in the end. They finally state, I have proved it. And it's up to you to see whether that stuff that they said constitutes a proof for you. So if you have enough strength, you could simply say the map can be four-colored. And there are even instances of this in the mathematical or physics community. For example, the famous statistical mechanics guy, Onsager, gave the answer to his famous problem. He didn't do anything but just write down the answer. So, what constitutes proof is a nice question. Now, let's see, continuing with this recollection. I had many conversations with Annetta and would sometimes visit her in her house at 25 Princelet Street in London. And this house was a work in progress, as you may know about it, all of you probably by now. In order to get up to the place where she worked, you had to climb some ladders. Now, I never liked climbing ladders. In fact, I think I had avoided it since I was a child. So I had to learn to climb a ladder in order to talk with her, and was proud that I managed to do that. And we had lots of conversations about Spencer Brown and laws of form and language and all of those kinds of things. And she had a very interesting sensitivity, so that sometimes you would be going along talking about something that you thought was not very likely to have any sharp divides, and then she would get very emphatic about something. For example, about hierarchy, the theme of hierarchy. And so we might be talking about the so-called law of crossing, which has marks over one another as opposed to marks next to one another. And she became extremely vituperative on that point, that this was hierarchy and really shouldn't be there. But of course, she wouldn't always have said that, and if you were to look at her thesis on the cybernetics of language, you would find marks over marks as well. But then, on the other hand, there are certain situations where that hierarchy comes in right in your face, and you're not going to allow it. And this was a period when she was making flags as an artistic project, and they were sewed next to one another. They were not sewed on top of one another, for sure. And so that theme of hierarchy is sort of embossed in my mind ever since those long conversations. And I got to thinking about it again when Bruce was talking the other day, because if you start with self-reference, which just comes back to itself, self-supporting, no hierarchy, just there, it easily turns into hierarchy. And maybe you don't want it to turn into hierarchy. Maybe you don't want it to turn into the thinking about the thinking about the thinking about, and so on. But it has that unstable character of popping up like that. And some people have more sensitivity to their likes and dislikes with regard to that than others. So those are some of my stories and recollections about my beginning interactions with cybernetics.
And for those of you that don't know Lou's work on knots, here's Lou, and not Lou.
First of all, thank you, Fred, for arranging this. I think it's a wonderful idea, and I appreciate being here with all my specific colleagues as well as my more general ones. First, I want to thank Stuart for being the first in this list, but also I think for being responsible, perhaps, for us still being here. You had a pivotal role in the history of the American society, and you revived it, resuscitated it, kept it going, funded it at a time when it needed it, and I'm not sure we would be here. So my thanks to you. And just to complete the loop, and without contradicting stories we've heard before, I can tell you a first-person story, which was the Urbana conference that everyone has mentioned, in which I go into the men's room and someone said something to me, which one always notes if a stranger says something to you in a men's room. And this worker there said to me, "Are you at the conference?" And I said, "Yes, this is a true story. This is my story." And he said, "Cybernetics, what is that?" He said, "Is that freezing dead people?" I swear to God, this is a true story. And I explained no, and he seemed a bit relieved after being terribly, terribly worried. And I can understand that, of course, cryogenics and so on and so forth. So this is a trivial story. The more important story is about Heinz, and this relates to some of the discussions that we've had. Another first-person story. We all have many, but I will refrain and tell you one, because it relates to the nature of the field and what we fight against, and perhaps what some of the resistance is. When I moved to Washington, D.C. in '81 to do contract work with Gordon Pask and with other people, I hired a physicist who had been my not advisor, coach when I was an undergrad. He was one of the people associated with the undergrad program I was in. His name was Jeffrey. And Jeffrey was very, very upset for the entire time we worked together with the idea that we would question how we know the world and whether we could know the world. So he was very upset with this idea of constructivism. And over again, he would be disgruntled. He was a wonderful person, and I hope to see him this week after decades of not seeing him. Brilliant character. And one day he came in and he was absolutely triumphant. And he said, "Paul, I've got you." I said, "What do you mean?" Well, he said, "When I walk across the room and I knock my knee against that chair, I feel pain. And when you walk across the room, you also have the same experience. Therefore, the chair is there." And I figured, oh shit, he's got me. So what did I do? I called Heinz. I called him on the phone. I can remember as vividly as I'm sitting with you here today, that phone call. Actually, it's probably a push-button phone. The other end of the phone, somebody answers. He goes, "Hello!" I say, "Heinz, this is Paul Pangaro." He says, "Paul Pangaro, hello!" I say, "Heinz, I have a problem." I tell him the story, and he says, "Paul, when you cross the room, you both feel pain. From there, everything is inference."
I'm wondering if anyone of us, this includes, has questions or stories that you'd also like to share. Or stories about others. Stu? I'm remembering, I'm trying to also be tolerant of silence, and maybe that wasn't expected. Is this really a participatory session? I'm remembering that there were gaps in the ASC. This is why we have a hard time saying, okay, yes, this is the 60th anniversary, because we know when the first one was. But there were years when we had 2 meetings. There were many years we had no meetings. But I'm remembering, Larry, you might have a recollection of this also, that in trying to get things going, we met with you and Klaus at Roger Conant's farm in Deer Isle, Maine, and with Barry Clemson, and got lost together. Larry, maybe you have some recollections of that? Sort of the starts and stops of reinvigorating a society.
I arrived at the University of Pennsylvania in 1974. One of my first courses was with Russell Akoff. Some of you may know the name. He has attended ASC conferences in the past. In that class, he announced that there was this conference on campus. It was the American Society for Cybernetics meeting over in the Annenberg School of Communication. Klaus Kreppendorf was the organizer for this. I didn't know what he was talking about. He encouraged us to go over there, see what was going on, but I was too busy, just getting started, taking courses, and so forth. But it turns out that that was the last conference of the American Society for Cybernetics until 1981. I won't go into details about why that happened, except to say the Constitution and bylaws of organizations make a difference. In this particular case, they weren't being followed, and there was no recourse. And it irritated people, and it affected the conference, apparently. And so Klaus, Doreen Stagg, and others went off and created their own organization, the American Cybernetics Association, ACA. A few people stuck with the American Society of Cybernetics, including Stewart and Barry Clemson, in particular. And they were friends. They got together often, but the conferences that were being held between that time related to cybernetics were held in conjunction with the Society for General Systems Research. And that was my first conference that I went to in 1977 in Denver. Heinz von Forster was just stepping down as president of the Society for General Systems Research. Margaret Mead was just stepping down recently as the president of the American Association for the Advancement of Science. Huge, huge organization. And the two organizations were meeting together at that time. And so it allowed some crossover. Heinz organized a panel at that conference. The panel included Margaret Mead, Ernst von Glasersfeld, Kenneth Boulding, and Cisco Varela. Joe Gogan. I'm in the audience here, my first conference ever. What the heck is going on here? and that continued. We continue to have those meetings in the cybernetics community, if you will. Would meet. Stuart would always be there. Bill started. I met him in 1979 at this conference. And the two organizations, Stuart Berry and Klaus in particular, decided that they would get back together again. Or they would try to. So they kept the name American Society for Cybernetics because it was incorporated and didn't want to change that. But took the Constitution and bylaws of the new organization and made that the Constitution and bylaws for the American Society for Cybernetics, which had in it recourses when people didn't abide by certain rules. When it came time to have the first American Society for Cybernetics meeting in 1981, it was Stuart again who called me up and said, would you organize this conference? Here I am, I don't know, I didn't know didn't know what was going on, but I'm living in the Washington D.C. area at the time, and Stuart, was down here, George Washington. They said, yeah, sure. It turned out I moved, so I really want to organize the program. Stuart and people here organized the local arrangements. But that became the first conference of the American Society for Cybernetics since 1974. I want to tell one story, follow up with Lou. Annetta Pedretti showed up at this conference. I had never met her before. I liked her in a strange way. It came to some point in the conference where I asked her and put her on a panel. The panel included Huntington Forrester and Swell Gladysfeld and I think Gordon Desk and Ranulph Glanville. And Annetta came up to me and she was livid. She said, "What? This panel? You told me who was going to be on this panel, and it's not who you told me." Well, it had been changed. Somehow, the wires got crossed and it got down. And I didn't know what to do, and so I lost it, I'll say. So what do you want me to do? And she said, I don't know, change it. I said, I can't change it. They're already there in the room. And she did go, and she did take a transcript of that panel, and it's available as one of the little books. So if you're interested, you can.
Self-reference.
Yeah, it was on self-reference was the topic. I was actually so mad that I did not attend this panel. But the positive thing about this was that Annetta and I then became very close friends, and remained that way, until the end. So.
I'll follow up on that when it gets there. No, go ahead.
So one of the context for the context of hugs for me was that when I got involved in this was very different than the academic activities. Can you hear me? Yeah. Oh, sorry. Thank you. In the history department, for example, or other places, these actually were people that was exciting. They were friends. They were, and they treated you like peers. People who were really superstars treated young people who had no idea what the hell we were doing like stars. And it was a heady experience to be doing all these conferences with all these people, some of whom I became very close friends with, in particular Larry and Fred, as well as Stuart. But it's also, you had this opportunity to interact with people like Heinz von Forster and Stafford Beer and Kenneth Boulding, Jim Miller, and others. And I was in this fortunate position, totally unexpected, because I got offered this job out of the blue in a field I had no credentials in, because Bowling and von Forrester had agreed to be the outside readers of my dissertation. The reason I mention that is because both of them, while having very different kinds of ways of looking at the world, although overlapping in other ways, they were both extremely generous people. And the first conference I ever went to was because Stuart Umpleby had actually, Stuart again, yeah. Stuart had told me about this SGSR meeting, and there was one in Boston, and I said, well, why don't I do something? Well, he asked me, why don't you do something? So I said, I'll do it. It's on social systems. And I said, well, I'm not sure what to do. I've never been to a conference, like you. I've never organized a session. What'll I do? And I was thinking about it, and I said, well, I'll call Kenneth Boulding up again. Because if I called Kenneth Boulding after reading some of his work and said, I don't understand any of this stuff, but I called him. Because where I was, grad students didn't do that, but I was working in a consulting firm that's doing high-level work for the Secretary of Defense's office, and you call people, you had questions. So I called, he answered the phone. And he answered every time I called him. I found that if you call people, it's amazing how often they'll answer the phone. And so I started saying, this is normal practice. Well, anyway, I said, I've never done one of these, what should I do? He said, well, you figure out what you want to talk about, and then you go ahead and you call some people and invite them to participate. And I said, well, I don't know anybody. I got Stuart and me. And that's it. He said, well, why didn't you invite me? And I said, who else should we invite? And he said, why don't you invite Alfred Kuhn? So we ended up having a session on social systems at this SGSR conference in Boston that had 275 attendees, 250 of which sat in our session because it was Kenneth Boulding. I had something similar happen at another conference later, a couple of years later, with Heinz von Forrester. Heinz was extremely generous and willing to do, and he said, you know, why don't you invite me? I'll be happy to help. But it didn't just extend to professional things. We were out there in California. He had retired to Pescadero, which was nearby. We'd gotten to know him. Joni and I had 3 young children in 2 years. We had twins and then a daughter. Our youngest daughter, was at the first ASC conference in 1981 because I couldn't leave her home. So, you know, she got a taste of the stuff early. But in the process of doing that, I was able to, because I was with this program with lots of students where there was a place. In other words, there was a place you could organize things because people knew about it. I was able to get Heinz to come and serve as a distinguished visiting professor for about 5 years. And because I was at San Jose State in the Cybernetics Systems program, and they said, how can you do that? Well, I had money because we were attracting lots of students, graduate level, undergraduate level, and he agreed to do that. Now I look back on it, he was 76 years old or something like that. Oh hell, I'm now 76. I didn't think of anybody, but he did. He'd drive over to Pescadero and go back at night. He would work on special projects. We did a recreation of the Cybernetics of Cybernetics. We called it I forget. I know the name of what it was, but we spent a whole year with 18 graduate students doing something on that. But, and here's where I want to then close the link. Early in that early part of it, he had said, because he would invite me to things. And this is the key thing. He had no need, got nothing out of it other than just being generous to invite somebody at my level and everything else. I had not done anything in my career. I was in a field that had no credential, you know. And he'd said, you know, there's this little interesting thing we're having with Gregory Bateson. Turned out to be Gregory Bateson's last public presentation. Bateson was largely the reason I got involved in cybernetics, because I was asking these questions in history about what's an historical fact, and learned out later that was what epistemology was, or at least an epistemological question. And they said, given what you're doing, it sounds like this, there's this guy, a really interesting guy, who's written this book called Steps in Ecology of Mind. So I read it, and what is an instinct changed my life. And especially since I then got to know his daughter later on. But the point was, that we're having this three-day session up in San Francisco. I don't think it was actually held at the Zen Center, but he was at the Zen Center dying shortly before he passed away. And his invitation only. I think Umberto was there. I'm not sure who else, but here it was. And here's the story that I think was really relevant. So too much context probably, but prologue. But he gave a talk on one of the days. I do not remember the days, but there were no more than 25 people in this little conference. And he finished talking, and I asked the question, would you take questions? He says, if we have time, but if you allow me to think about my answer. And so other people were asking questions, and I finally got the nerve to ask a question myself. I don't have any idea what the question was. He told a very interesting story. Some of you may know it about advanced planning and woods in England when they needed to rebuild the Radcliffe camera or something like that. And so I've got the specifics somewhere written down. But the point was, I asked a follow-up question again, I don't know. And he said, all right. And he sat there thinking about this a really long time. It just seemed like, oh my God, what is going on? This is, did I do something wrong? This must be crazy. And it might have been 5 minutes. It felt like 5 hours. And then he looked at me and said, no, I've thought about it. I don't have anything else to add. I have never seen that happen then or since in a professional conference. So I just thought, and I learned a lot from that. I thought that was a really powerful way of doing things. And I wanted to share it with you.
Thank you.
So we're also very sensitive to sense of place. Pilla, I can't see you raising your hand, but I wonder if you have something else to add now.
After that comment?
Well, you can say I have nothing else to add, so you have to think about it for a minute first.
No, that's fine.
Well, in terms of unusual answers, I remember seeing Umberto Maturana answering a question by drawing a frog, and it comes right out of his hand onto the blackboard.
What?
Magic. Building on the stories, one of the things that occurs to me just looking around here is that with our ASC meetings, we're very good. We have a history of, yes, we have a program, and Claudia has done a fantastic job with her support. But I wanted to lean in, I forget who mentioned Annetta, Larry mentioned Annetta Pedretti's.
Many people mentioned it.
Yeah, several people. One of the things that's always kind of evolved as part of our history is that we have a high regard for sense of place in where we are. So we're not just meeting inside a hotel, inside a friend center, but we have a way of making the space ours. And so I was remembering, since you mentioned Russ Akoff, 1984, I was the, convener of the meeting, the organizer of the meeting. And I'd gotten a budget from Russ Akoff from his Bush Center at the University of Pennsylvania, where I was also his student with Larry, to run the meeting. And he gave me an office and an actual telephone, and so I could call people to see if they would come to the meeting. And we had the meeting, and several people here helped put that meeting on. The meeting was at the Rittenhouse Plaza Hotel in Rittenhouse Square in Philadelphia. And Annetta got there and said, this space won't work. It's got a formal ballroom, which is where we have the plenary sessions, and the formal ballroom, it'd be wonderful to go back and look. I have actually VHS recordings of those sessions, except I can't play them because I don't have a VHS player anymore. But the room had a hall of mirrors, and there's Varela giving one of the 3 keynote talks, looking around the room, seeing his reflection, as he's talking about the importance of reflection and self-reference, saying, is this a trap? Recognizing the space. But that wasn't good enough for Annetta. She wanted to have a place where we could have dedicated conversations that were outside the formal settings. And Annetta called it, we need a space for the anti-conference, where people could put together the conversations that led to this Princelet edition, since you mentioned Princelet, So we found a room in the basement where people could write notes to each other that became the basement of Anita's book. But to this day, it's not only that we kind of take a space and make it ours, and I guess we're doing that here, but also to recognize that the typical boundaries of a conference don't apply to us. That the movement from one place to another, walking together, is part of the conference. It's not just, okay, we'll have a session, we'll have coffee, but recognizing that it's our various ways of coming together, our various ways of meeting with each other, our various manners of continuing the conversation also afford the very nature of what it is that we are doing. So, this space is ours, but at the same time, if you're going back to the DC Art Center, do it in a group. Walk together, get lost together, wander together, and realize that this is also part of the essence of the stories that bring us together as ASC. So we did want to make this participatory, and as you can tell, some of us are better at managing time than others, even though we have people who have written about Maturana's ideas of zero time.
Yes, they have.
Yeah.
I have nothing to say. Believe it or not.
Comments from anyone? Questions for the grandparents?
There was a
at the table
story
today?
though, somewhere that triggered a story, but I can't
Peter?
remember what
The view from behind the camera?
Oh, gosh.
Okay, so I'll stay behind the camera. Just that I had a wonderful relationship with Bill since he introduced me to cybernetics at the Adolf Coors Company in about 1983. And I can't believe that time, so it's been wonderful to fill in some gaps today. And I'm very interested in how to continue the story with my grandchildren. And I think that's the challenge that we will face. So I think that's really, I'd like to thank you all for assembling this meeting today. And I'm doing my best to put it on the archives in real time, on the ASC YouTube channel and on the College of Exploration website, and also a couple of other places. So thank you very much, and thank you all.
Yeah, of course that's good enough. Ray? Yeah. Ray, then Judy? Yeah.
The ASC, by its name, tends
This is Ray Eisen, by the way.
yes, tends to emphasise American. I wonder if those present have got any reflections to offer on what happens when you take the ASC somewhere else, and the conferences that have been held in other locations, and how Fred's notion of travel and being together and stepping outside has been enacted in other contexts.
Oh, I can tell you are setting me up, are you not?
Yeah, so let's just tribute to Ranulph Glanville and his work. There was going to be an ASC meeting in China, and for one reason or another, it was not able to occur at the last minute. And so Ranulph decided the American Society for Cybernetics should have a meeting in Bolton, England. And it should be a very interactive conversational meeting about acting, learning, and listening, I think, of some sort. And so we were in Bolton, Manchester, and I was able to get on a plane from Washington on Sunday night and get there on Monday morning and spend the week with many of the folks here, having a great time talking and conversing and walking around Bolton and experiencing Manchester. And then I got back on a plane on Friday night and came back to Washington, D.C. And it was a lot of fun meeting, and it was very conversational, and it was very performative, because we had these, Ranulph had structured it such that these three themes were in relation to each other, and we had to take a leadership on one topic for the conversation for maybe, I forget the timing, but maybe the morning, and then in the afternoon we had to all come back into the plenary, and we had to act it out. And I know that Ray was acting out and Larry was acting out, and another part of the whole experience was another place in the evening, which was a theatre where the actual performances occurred, and that was an amazing set of experiences as well. I don't know how much time we've got. Have we got to be out of here?
Well, I don't know. Time, what is time?
Well, time, okay.
I think we have
3:30, we
yeah,
have
we
until
20 minutes.
3:30,
Yeah.
yes.
Okay, all right, I was just checking.
Well,
on-
you
on
have
space
your
time.
story another 25 minutes.
Yes. Well, it's just an illustrative way of Ranulph's, Glanville's contribution, as president, which he and I got on very well, and I used to go and eat cake with him on the seafront of Portsmouth, where he lived. And so thanks to Ranulph for a lot of contributions.
Yeah, thanks. And it's such a good question, Ray, because we've also pondered that.
You're right, I have something to say. Oh, I'm sorry.
I'm talking as I'm walking. Is that okay?
Okay.
So we did have the 1990 meeting was actually in Oslo, just outside Oslo in Sundvolden. And we had some interesting occasions there where Umberto and his colleague brought a cat into the country, which you can't do. So Per Helmerson, who was gracious enough to help organize that meeting at Sundvolden, wound up going back and forth between the airport where Maturana's cat had to be housed during the meeting, making sure the cat was okay, all the while running the meeting. So again, the boundaries of our meetings have no limit. Judy.
So I do have something to say. This is a little story about Donaldson, Rodney Donaldson, Frank Galuska, Maturana, Brune, and me. So I started exploring, I actually was exposed to cybernetics by an African-American man in the late 80s and developed what I called behavioral cybernetics, which was about escalation, de-escalation of behavior in complex systems. Because I worked with emotionally disturbed children, and this was how do you talk a kid down without having to put hands on. So I came to DC, did my colloquium for the Union Institute. They said you have to do theory development. I said, no way, I'm doing theory development. I went to the Library of Congress. I found a book called Steering and Navigating Complex Systems for the 21st Century, the New Cybernetics. I wrote 5 of the people who had articles. They were all from Europe and Chile. And every one of them wrote me back. Talk about responses. And one of them invited me to Brussels, Eric Rossell. He was a brilliant guy. I'll leave it at that. Anyway, so I go there, and I had to go to Europe to find out about the American Society for Cybernetics. They turned me on to the American Society for Cybernetics. I came home. Communication, inclusion, the whole bit. I came home and I called the current president of the American Society for Cybernetics. They gave me his name, Rodney Donaldson. Called him up, called again, and again, and again, and again. I'm like, what the hell? It's supposed to be about inclusion. It's supposed to be about communication. What's going on here? Called again, and again. Finally, I get a call from Donaldson, and he says, you've been so persistent, I decided to call you back. Thank you very much. Yeah. So it just so happened, this was in late 91, and they were having an ASC, he was doing an ASC conference, which was incredible. 65 cyberneticians on an island off the Puget Sound with Umberto Maturana and Herbert Bruns, the cybernetics of Umberto Maturana and Herbert Brun, organized by Rodney Donaldson, conversation, lecture, performance of performance. Arguing. No, it was fantastic. They weren't arguing, they were presenting. Now Herbert, of course, argued with the of course. And I've been thinking about this comment. Somebody said, are you all, somebody asked me, he told this story. Are you saying we're all stupid? And Herbert's response, no, not all. That was his response. This guy. I didn't understand a word he was saying, right? That was Herbert. By the end of the conference at Union Institute, you had to find 2 people in the area you were studying that weren't professors at the institution to be on your committee. By the end of the conference, I asked both Maturana and Herbert to be, here's this composer, artist, politico, and this scientist, quiet guy, right? And they both agreed to do it. And Maturana was like, well, are you asking me for my ideas or because of who I am? I said, I don't know who you are. I had no idea. I had read one article, it was a panel discussion in the New Cybernetics book, that was Gordon Pass, Margaret Bowden, and Maturana, and a few other people. And it was I still read it. I think it's a seminal paper. So anyway, that's my story about Broome, Donaldson,
And Jude.
Maturana,
And Jude Lombardi.
and me.
I love stories of the past, and you heard some from me.
That was Frank.
I have the added burden, if I may say that, as being current president, to not just tell stories of the past, but to be concerned about the future. Where does it go? Where do we go? Who are we? And so on. The idea of identity of the organization is, of course, critical. So I'm riffing on the question earlier about, oh, it's an American society for cybernetics. Now, parenthetically, let me say there's a discussion with the ISSS, the International Society for Systems Sciences. And some of you may have seen this little contretemps I had with Mike Jackson about the nature of the epistemology of systems versus, carefully chosen, the epistemology of cybernetics, and that will keep going, it's kind of fun. But someone said in a meeting recently, I apologize for not being able to attribute it, but also that someone had said it before that, someone else, which is ASC might be the thing preserved in a way that KFC has preserved, for example. Those of you who are not from this country, Kentucky Fried Chicken is no longer relevant, but KFC is the brand. We might keep the ASC and turn the A into A Society for Cybernetics.
And as president, you can do that.
Better than me.
My comment to that is that I like the irony that we're the American Society for Cybernetics and we stand for epistemological things and philosophical things, and this is highly un-American.
Yeah, we lose the irony if we change that.
Fred, Elena one.
Yeah, Elena. Whose name begins with A.
Yeah, sorry about
The Elena Society.
I wanted to mention that there was another side to all this, which is a side that any society could do. And one of my recollections of Herbert Broome and Stafford Beer was the two of them singing while Herbert played the piano. And Herbert was a musician down to his fingertips, so he did all these wonderful experimental things. Like, I will never use the phrase, "I told you so," except in the context of what he did. But he could also play any tune at all. And so he'd play Broadway tunes, he'd play whatever, and he and Stafford would be being musicians together. And something like that is something that doesn't happen everywhere.
And Paul.
And Paul.
And Herbert. In 1992.
Yeah.
At the piano.
I told you so.
So I met Herbert at a piano, and
Oh, wow.
we had a wonderful time. He explained to me that the reason why he knew all of these American show tunes is because he left Germany, and he went to school in Israel, but discovered that he knew more about music than that school did, so he made his living by working in nightclubs, I suppose, or bars or whatever in Israel. And we did the show at various times at the ASC. And one time on a Friday night, we did all the songs we knew together. And on Saturday, people were very kind, and they said, "Well, are you going to sing tonight?" And I turned to Herbert, completely panicked. I said, "Herbert, we've done all of the songs we know. We can't repeat." And he said, "Paul, you are a commercial artist. You are paid to repeat."
With respect to the future.
Please.
In 2012, there was an ASC conference in Asilomar, California. That was the last conference at which I saw Humberto Maturana. I contacted him afterwards, and he sent me a paper It turned out that much of what was in that paper was also in the letter that he'd written to the ASC in 2009 when he accepted the Nobel Wiener Award. But in it, he proposed a zero-time cybernetic. That was his term, zero-time cybernetics. I'm still trying to wrap my mind around that. But it, yeah, what happens when you take time out of your formulations? Can you do that? And I'll just leave it at that, but that's a challenge. It's a challenge to this organization. Perhaps, if you want to take it up. But it's
For very short meetings.
well, or very long.
Very long.
Yeah.
Yep. I want to just get back to just reinforcing a point that I touched on before, which is that even now, 40 years later, and the number of people, I mean, Stuart was it right at the beginning. He's still here with it. Larry, I think, if I understood correctly, you've been to every ASC meeting? Or almost?
I missed about 2 or 3.
I mean, so you have people here who are committed, very few of which are making their living doing this, at least directly. But again, the thing that I find so powerful is this mixing of the professional and the personal. And in most cases, all of us get angry at times and do things like that, but people you may not agree with, even or there, but there's this spirit of, we're in this is interesting, we have it. I mean, it's exemplified just in the session before this one that Paul and Kate did with respect to transgenerational. You know, shades of Heinz von Forster and Kenneth Boulding and others, and it's more of a tradition in the ASC than it is in the ISSS by sure. This is not a tradition over there. But people keep coming back to this, I think. But I won't say that. I keep coming back to this because I find the field so important and so valuable, personally and professionally. And I really enjoy spending time with the people that I know. Some that I've known for a long time, very closely, that are friends outside just the field, and new people that we meet. And I've been involved, and I think there's many cases with many people here, I've been involved with an awful lot of other organizations, professionally and others, and you just don't, I have not seen that anyplace else in the same way. And there's something about that that makes it very connective, especially when you can then have conversations, and I could recount some, I won't now, but it's the cybernetics not just of love, and the cybernetics of organizations, but the cybernetics of parenting, the cybernetics of, you know, the family. I mean, I would change my approach to parenting, to be really honest. Some of you may know this. I grew up in McLean, right nearby. Just found out that Bruno Heights, same place. I couldn't believe it. And in the process of doing that, I'm the oldest of 12 kids.
Whoa.
7 sisters. 7 sisters. And so you learn how to deal with variety with 12 kids. And but I was, you know, Joni and I, we had our kids. We moved to California in a school bus, got this job at San Jose State. And we were pretty sure that what we were going to do, you know, we'd just be fine. Nature versus nurture. It's almost all about nurture. It has nothing to do with nature. And we're ready to go rolling. But we had twins. We had boy and girl twins. And I said right from the beginning, it was actually the semester before, I said, I can't keep teaching the way that I'm teaching. Because I'm teaching like I was taught.
Yeah.
I said, so this was the year before, wasn't the semester before, the year before, so the first 78, so I started in 77. 78, I said I need to change, and this came out of involvement in the 60s. I've got to practice what I preach. That was the overwhelming lesson that I learned from being involved in the 60s. And I was sticking flowers in the guns just before my second date with this, when I met this girl. And one more date and we were engaged. I mean, I had no idea what the hell I was doing. But it was wrapped up in there. But this notion of practice what you preach. I said, I've got to change all of my teaching so that I am teaching cybernetically and systemically. And how do we do that? And what do we do? And then we had twins. And I came back to Tony and I said, it's not enough to change my teaching. I'm going to change my parenting. We had wonderful parents, a great time. I said, I can't live in a situation where mom and dad are in charge of everything that's going on. I want us to be collectively making decisions and interacting and doing things. And so we started, we changed our whole style of parenting. Joey said, I'm not so sure about this, you know, but not that there are magic answers, but the point being that this field, in the way that I haven't found in any of the other fields that I've been involved with, can have a very powerful effect on what we do personally and professionally in our relations with all kinds of people. And that is priceless. If you live one life and you get to stumble into this, you know, rabbit hole, and all of a sudden it turns out to be you found the master password to the universe, that's a pretty special thing to fall into. And that's, I fell into it. I had no clue what was going on. So I just want to say thanks to the field and thanks to the friends. So.
Yeah, thank you, Bill, and thanks everyone. So just a few opening up closings. I mean, Ranulph had this wonderful way of putting things into words and papers that had these titles like opening up closings, closings that open up to future ideas.
Whitening the black.
And I really, yes, the whiteness of black boxes and linearity of the nonlinearity of linear systems. And I want to build on Paul's idea of really looking to the future. And as the current president, so I guess you're president for at least some of the future, we're dedicated to you for that. But I'm also thinking back, you know, once you're mentioning family, we have this included within those notes that I mentioned, people writing about the '84 conference. Our son was about 3 months old at the time. Well, he's now 40, but so it was a long time ago. And we had this picture of him in the meeting in Philadelphia sitting on Stafford Beer's lap. And Stafford, for those of you, had this enormous beard, and the picture is really sort of the definition of awe. If you can imagine, what does awe look like in a 3-month-old kid? It's this, our son Rolf, looking at Stafford. But I invite you to think about, as you're listening to the senior citizens here, reflecting on stories of the past, what stories might you bring to the future, and what does this mean for our continued identity as a Society for Cybernetics, the Ara-Poetic Society for Cybernetics, any Society for Cybernetics,
The anti-communication.
the Anti-Society for Cybernetics.
The alternative.
And I also, it reminds me, this is why I'm not very
After
good. Since Larry mentioned this, and Jude mentioned zero time, we have I think it's floating around here, the Cybernetics and Human Knowing Journal has a special issue on Umberto Maturana that Pile and I put together. Pile did the bulk of the work.
And that Larry and I wrote an article about
Right,
zero
and so
time.
there's an article by Jude and Larry called, oddly enough, Zero Time Cybernetics. So thanks everyone for indulging us at our Thanksgiving dinner.